When I first stepped off my porch on April 1st, 1983, I wasn't sure at all that I would be returning. Nobody had ever walked alone around the world, probably because it was foolhardy and impossible. What made me think I could do it? Leaving my home, my brothers and sisters, my mother, and my father was the hardest thing I had ever done. As I was walking away, something told me to stop and take a last look at the house. There, in the window of the room where he was confined with illness, I saw the gaunt figure of my father looking out at me. It was the last time I would see him. I dedicate my story to his memory.
Hi, I'm Stephen Newman, the World Walker. I want to share with you the story of a dream that wouldn't go away. It began one rainy Ohio afternoon when I was 9 years old. I was up in the attic of our old house, lost in the pages of a big stack of old National Geographics. Although the covers of those magazines were worn and faded, the beauty of the glossy photographs inside was still very much alive. What a magical world we live in. I knew right then and there that someday I would have to go to visit all of those exotic lands and meet all of those smiling faces. That night, as I lay in bed, my imagination was still swirling. I remember my mother came in to say goodnight, and I looked up at her and said, "Mom, when I grow up, I know exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a writer, and I'm going to walk around the world." She chuckled and looked at me and said, "You mean you're going to be like a soldier of fortune?" I said, "Yeah." I didn't know what it meant, but it sounded good. Well, that little boy did grow up to be the writer he envisioned. But the other half of my childhood dream of walking around the world became lost and nearly forgotten in a world of headlines and news reports about assassinations, wars, nuclear arms, and terrorism. Like I suppose most people do, I began to think of this world as a fearful place. A place where hatred and violence far outweigh love and compassion. Then one day in 1977, I was sitting behind my desk in the newspaper office where I worked, staring out the window at all the people passing by. All of a sudden I realized how little I knew about them and their lives. Sure, I knew what newspapers and television said, what government said, but what were those people and all of the others out there in the rest of the world really like? I couldn't believe they were all that different from me. But how could I know for sure? Finally, after 6 years of preparation and struggling with my own doubts, I could no longer resist the urge to put on the backpack and the hiking boots and set out to find out for myself the answers to the questions in my heart. Those first couple weeks across Ohio were far rougher than I could ever have imagined. I must have packed enough things in my backpack to get me around the entire world, let alone across Ohio. Every joint in my body and every muscle was screaming for relief after the first 100 miles. I remember my knees were swollen that big, and by the time I got to Athens, Ohio, on the east side of the state, I was ready to give it up. I knew that there's no way I could make it if I hurt that much. Well, I stayed there for a couple weeks, got over a few of the aches and pains, and then hobbled on my way down the road. I decided that I'll go to West Virginia, and there I'll quit. Make it look like at least I tried. Well, when I got to Belpre, Ohio, which is right on the Ohio River, and it's the last town before you cross the bridge into West Virginia, I went into the mayor's office to get a signature in my logbook, which I do through every town and village that I pass through. And there, the mayor gave me this key. And he was so proud. And I felt, oh boy, I can't give up now, not after somebody's giving me the key to their city. So I thought to myself, I'll go on a little bit more, maybe to Washington, D.C. And then there I will give up for sure. Well, this key got me through that first major challenge in my walk. And I also found out, too, that it had another use. It was great for opening up pop bottles. Well, on my way to Washington, D.C., I was to meet a special person who would typify very much the spirit that I met in people all around the world. I was crossing through the Shenandoah Valley in Northern Virginia very early in the morning, and there was a kind of a fog and a mist still in the air that morning. And I heard this voice calling out to me, "Yoo-hoo, yoo-hoo, young man!" And I looked up, and there in a little house on the top of a big hill was this little old lady with very white hair. She was standing there waving at me as if trying to get my attention. And then she goes, "Young man, have you had any breakfast?" And I looked up at her and I said, "No, I haven't." And I hadn't either, and I was very hungry. I hadn't eaten for at least a day. And then she kind of stomped her foot on the floor as if though she was giving me a directive. And she goes, "Will you come up here right now and you eat some?" And so I went up there because I felt if I didn't, she was going to call the sheriff on me or something. And she hustled me into the kitchen and she whipped up this big breakfast and she stuffed me all full of good food. And later on, I went out on the front porch and was getting ready to leave. I put my big pack back on and I was standing there and looking down at her and I said, "Ma'am, why did you have me come up here and eat breakfast? I'm a stranger and you don't know me." She was very shy, and she looked out over the valley as if she was collecting her thoughts for a moment. And then she looked up at me, and I'll never forget. She goes, "When I was a little girl, my mother used to always read to me from the Bible, and she used to tell me that heaven sends angels to you disguised as men to test your charitableness. And if you fail the test, you may not get to go to heaven." And then she got a little red in the face, as if she was embarrassed at something. And she goes, "I'm 89 years old now, and my eyesight's not so good. And when I looked out the screen door this morning, I saw this very tall figure coming through the woods. And I could feel my heart starting to beat very rapidly, because nobody walks through the forest that early in the morning. And then as I watched you getting closer, I saw this big thing on your back, and I thought, oh, those are wings. This must be one of those angels sent to test me." Of course, what she saw was my backpack. And then she goes, "I'm just too darn old now to blow my chance at heaven. And there was no way I was going to let you go by, because I may never get to feed another angel again." Well, I had to laugh. And when I walked away from her cabin that morning and down to the road, I had a really warm feeling inside. Not only did I have a good breakfast in me, but I also knew that, that maybe I wasn't an angel, but surely she was. And as I was to go around the world, I was to find a lot more angels just like her.
As my journey pulled me away from that kind lady's cottage and surrounded me with settings that seemed out of heaven itself, I realized how close to and dependent upon Mother Nature we really are. At last, I reached the Atlantic Ocean, and I dreamed, like I suppose everybody does, about what lay on the opposite shore thousands of miles to the east. I knew what was on this side. There were indeed so many friendly angels all around me, waiting to share their lives with me, even in New York City. By walking, I was exposing myself to people on the streets, and they all seemed to have something to share or a story to tell. Except for this very little angel in Boston. He just gave me this look. As the sun rose on my last day in America before flying to Ireland, I felt a great love for this country of mine, yet I was more eager than ever to discover the treasures that I knew lay beyond these shores. Ireland was all that I expected it would be. Beautiful countryside, a deep sense of history. It was the perfect environment for a walker. Meeting people like this shepherd, he couldn't wait to introduce me to his entire family. In fact, all of Ireland seemed to be populated by happy, healthy people. As it turned out, they were to be the most fun-loving of all the societies I explored. But what a difference politics can make. How my spirit sank as I crossed that invisible barrier into Northern Ireland. It was a beautiful but turbulent land.
The troubles in Northern Ireland really hit a soft spot in my heart, because that's where my roots lie. Still, I was surprised to see how well they took it in stride. I can remember a little town up in Northern Ireland called Larne. It's supposed to be the oldest city in Ireland. There, the Lord Mayor asked me to come up to his chambers to have a meeting with him. He wanted to get me to write some good stories about Northern Ireland because he was hoping to attract American industry there. They have a very serious problem with unemployment. So I went up to see the Lord Mayor in his big fancy chambers upstairs of the town hall. It was very elaborate with the chandeliers and the oak walls and the thick carpeting and the very fancy old furniture in there. And the mayor and I sat on the Davenport for a long time, and he told me all kinds of nice and funny stories about Northern Ireland. And I began to feel pretty good myself after a little while. And so I said, yes, okay, I will write something good about Northern Ireland. And then after he was wrapping up his speech, and it had gone on for at least half an hour by this time, suddenly the double doors that opened into this room flew open, and the old doorman from downstairs, he had white hair, and he was all red and flushed and everything, and he's out of breath, and he goes, Lord Mayor, there's a boom downstairs. And I said, oh, no. And the mayor goes, be very calm. He says, don't panic. I'll go down and check it out. I'm used to this sort of thing. And he took off with the old man, and they ran off and left me by myself. And I was sitting there, and I was expecting any minute to be blown out on the street through the windows. And I was really anything but calm. I was very, very frightened. And I remember I ran over to the corner of the room, and I squatted in the corner like some idiot, waiting for, this bomb to go off. And then, after a while, I got to thinking to myself, now wait a second. Didn't the man say that the bomb was in a white plastic sack with a white wire? And I had this very bad feeling come over me. And I said, uh-oh. And I looked over at my backpack, and I said, where's my bag with my dirty laundry? I didn't see it anywhere. And suddenly things began to come back to me, and I remembered that before coming in to see the Lord Mayor, I had stopped outside to comb my hair, and I'd put that white plastic sack up on the window behind the bars. I knew that was it. And I ran down the steps as fast as I could, and I stopped about halfway down, and I looked out the front window out on the street, and there I could see all these soldiers around this white bag out in the middle of the street. They were getting ready to blow it up. Oh, no. I didn't know what to do. Do I stay here and just go back upstairs and pretend like I never saw this? Or do I go out there and tell them that that's my dirty laundry? And then I got to thinking to myself, what brand of underwear do you wear? And I thought, Fruit of the Loom. Surely nobody in Northern Ireland wears Fruit of the Loom. And I knew then that I had to go out there and tell them that it was my underwear. Because if I didn't, and they blew it up, they would find that label sooner or later, and they'd know that it was some Yank's underwear. So I had to rush out there and say, no, wait a minute, you know, it's my underwear, don't blow it up. Well, luckily it was Northern Ireland, because the Irish have a good sense of humor. Still, though, it illustrated very well just how the troubles are right beneath the surface.
So often in my last days on the Emerald Isle, I wondered what kind of future those growing up in Northern Ireland have, what kind of future he has. The low mountains and wide grassy plains of Scotland helped to melt away the tension of Northern Ireland that was so saddening my heart. And further along, in the garden-like properties of rural England and the majesty of her city's architecture, I found I could relax again. I took a boat across the English Channel and landed in the beautiful province of Normandy in France. And it was while I was wandering through that region's lush farmlands that I found myself losing the battle to contain the homesickness in my heart, only to come across a vast cemetery of American war dead. I talked with the American caretaker there, grateful to finally find a conversation I could understand. He reminded me that others before me had known of far greater fear and pain and homesickness than I had. Freed of my sudden bout of moodiness, I continued through the French towns and villages. I've got to say that they have the oddest cars I've ever seen. Look at this. There's room for the pack and the bread, but where do I go? Eventually, my thoughts turned to what lay over the Pyrenees, 700 miles of Spain. I meandered through the Spanish countryside, lost in another world, where the past rode along on the second hand of the present as if it had every right in the world to still be around. As if the darkness that I sometimes sensed around the fringes of life there was really quite normal after all. And perhaps that even the fear I was carrying toward my next goal, Africa, would somehow disappear into the Mediterranean fog. This road sign in Morocco says it all, I think. I was on a new continent, Africa, with baffling hieroglyphics and vestiges of an ancient past jumbled together with the familiar symbols of my own society. And there was something far more disturbing, a harsh abundance of poverty and squalor in every town and city I passed through. Which was all the more reason to keep my path on the secondary roads in the small country lanes, where the bigger smiles and the slower pace were always so much more to the liking of the Huckleberry Finn in me.
Africa was such a beautiful place to walk in. I really enjoyed it. Big peaks covered with snow and valleys green and lush like something out of Ireland or China. I really felt like I was in a novel when I was walking across there. But I still could never quite be at ease because you always sense that somewhere up ahead there's danger. And sure enough, while I was crossing the Atlas Mountains in northern Algeria, one night very late under a full moon, and with about 2 feet of snow on the ground, I heard this snorting noise, sort of like, and I didn't know what it was. First I thought it was my stomach, because I was always hungry. And when I looked through the snow, I didn't see anything, so I started walking a little more. And then I heard it again, only louder and more ominous. And I looked over, and my God, there was this huge black creature with tusks sticking out to here, and big fangs like that on a big long snout, and eyes that gleamed like shiny coal, and bristles sticking up everywhere. It was a wild boar. And I thought, oh my gosh, you know, this thing's gonna kill me. And it came at me charging with snow flying all over, coming at me. I didn't know what to do, and I stood there, and then it slid to a stop about 20 feet away, and we stared each other down. And I walked on a little bit further, a little bit more, and then I heard another sound off to my left, and there was another pig. And I walked on a bit more, and another pig, and another one. And they were all starting to follow me and bunched together. And pretty soon there was 13 of them, and I knew, uh-oh, I better get up a tree, because these guys aren't going to be afraid with so many of them versus one of me. And so I found this tree, and I climbed up it with my backpack on my back and everything. And I stayed up there figuring they'd go away after a little while. But they were there all night down below, just waiting to have me for breakfast. And it was up there shivering, because all I had was a sweater like this on. And it was very, very cold that night. Well, by morning, they finally went away, and I was able to crawl down out of that tree. But I was so frozen and so cold, I remember I could hardly move my fingers. And I kind of shuffled off and quickly got out of those mountains that day. But I caught a very bad cold from that experience, and I ended up staying for 2 or 3 days in my sleeping bag, just sweating it out.
What a relief it was indeed to have those cold mountains and their fanged inhabitants behind me. Compared to Morocco and Algeria, Tunisia was a grassy playland of wandering thoughts and delightful illusions, like this small primitive village I saw from a distance that turned out to be a farmer's house-shaped haystacks. When my final destination on the dark continent, Tunis, came into view, I had to admit that even with all the wild adventures I had experienced, I was still very glad to be sailing back to Europe. Africa was just too much at home with danger and intrigue to be very safe for a lone American walker. After 5,000 miles and 13 months of this journey, I now found myself in South Italy, ambling about the rolling grassy countryside and vineyards with the devil-may-care freedom of King Hobo himself. Even my stories back to the newspapers in America took on a greater air of romance as I continually found my best discoveries in places I had never expected to come across, like the abandoned villas I usually slept in at night. I even found an entire abandoned city, which a mere 400 years before had been the playground of the rich. My size 12s carried me on into northern Italy's more moist and hilly olive-growing region along the Adriatic Sea, all the way to what was perhaps the crown jewel of my 4 months in charming Italia, Venice. There, my imagination floated along its watery passages for 4 days, leaving me with the feeling that no one, not even the best of artists, could capture its unforgettable beauty. From one gem to another may be the best way to describe my passage from Italy into Yugoslavia, then into Greece. Though the people still kept me enthralled with their friendliness and old-world lifestyles, it was a thing of awe to see closely just how harsh the earth they had to work could be at times. For many, life was one of basics and very little money that had to be made any way possible. Theirs was an existence that, to my camera, looked not at all that far removed from that of their ancestors.
Turkey was one country that I wasn't looking forward to visiting. I'd heard so many bad things about them. And I remembered particularly a movie I'd seen several years ago about a young American tourist who went there and was arrested by the police and thrown in jail and was beaten up. But, of course, the Turks didn't turn out to be anything like what a lot of people told me. And I found this true in many of the countries, but particularly here. And when I look back on the Turks, I'm almost tempted to think that they were one of the warmest people that I had the privilege of visiting. A good example of that were some Turkish telephone linemen that stopped one day and rolled down the window on their van and asked me if I was the man walking around the world. Well, I said yes. I was a little surprised. I didn't know anybody in central Turkey knew who I was. And then they asked me if I'd like a free phone call to my parents back in America. Well, sure. There was no way I was going to turn down a free phone call. It wasn't often that I got to speak to my parents. So they got out of the van in the middle of the storm and climbed up the pole in all that rain and lightning and wind, and somehow one of them got the line connected to their telephone in the van there. And then they gave me the headset, and I held it up to my ear and I listened, and I could hear the ringing way, way off. And after a little while, the ringing stopped. Someone had picked it up at my home. It was my dad. And from far, far away, I could hear this tiny little voice saying, "Hello? Hello? Who is this?" I screamed and I ranted and I raved into that darn thing, but I couldn't get my father to hear me. The connection was bad. And I put it again to my ear, and then something happened that I'll never forget. There was a long silence, and then, ever so softly, as if though coming from a very, very far corner of the universe, I could hear crying. For some reason, my father was crying. And then he said, "Steve, is that you, son? Steve?" And then suddenly, he was gone, blown away by the wind. The men scrambled up the pole and tried to reconnect us, but it was no use.
My remaining miles in Turkey were as desolate as the moon. Bald and uninviting, it looked a place created solely for woe and disaster. In its darkness, everything not a part of its unworldly setting stood out like the objects in a Salvador Dali painting. Nearly as poor as the North Africans, the fervently Muslim Eastern Turks were mostly friendly gypsies who spent all their lives searching for work. But I was one nomad who could appreciate the simpler pleasures of this world, like prayers to Allah and a lunch of rough bread dipped in plum jam and yogurt. The halfway point in my world walk, Turkey's rough, though mostly warm faces helped to remind me that what I had set out 2 years before to do, to get into people's hearts and minds, was still very much alive and well. On my first day on the road in Pakistan, I met a family of refugees from Afghanistan, one of the 2 countries I had to fly around to continue my walk. Pakistan's Muslim heritage was a reminder of the other missing link, Iran. But from the company I had on the road I was traveling, I knew I was in an exotic new land. And as usual, there was no place like the marketplace for excitement. But after a few days, my feet once again sought the roads less traveled. It was always a joy for me to visit schools, and this open-air classroom in Pakistan was no exception. The children always seemed glad to be visited, too, although in Pakistan all of the education had an unmistakably militaristic tone to it. In fact, after several months, I began to tire of the stares from strangers, and the once exotic bustle of Pakistan turned into a nightmare of jostling crowds and unpleasant clamor. But surely what lay ahead would be much worse. If this was only Pakistan, what would India be like? To my surprise, India was a land of great tranquility and natural beauty, with a deep spiritualism that imbued every living thing with a sense of godliness. As I walked along the oldest road in the world, the Grand Trunk, I saw a gentle people living in harmony with nature, and in my heart I heard the song of India.
The saddest time on my walk occurred while I was crossing India. On Christmas night of 1984, I called home to wish the family Merry Christmas. And the first thing my mother said to me was, "Stephen, I have something terrible to tell you. Your father has died." It was a shock to me to learn that my father had died over a month before. And I thought back to that phone conversation in Turkey and realized that that had been our last contact on this planet, and that Dad was not going to be there when I got home. Suddenly, again, I wanted so much to just give up what seemed like a silly, stupid journey and just go home, get away from it, and be back at my family where I belonged. My mother reminded me, though, that I was no longer out there walking by myself, but that there were many people following me through my stories, and that they were depending on me to tell them just what this world is really like. And so I continued across India, along the base of the Himalaya mountains toward Calcutta. But along the way, the crowds of people grew thicker and thicker, and the curious came to me, sometimes in the thousands, to see what I looked like, and to push and to grab at me. It was all I could do to keep from fainting many times, and yet all I wanted more than anything was to be by myself, to be with my thoughts and to think of my father. It was a very, very difficult time for me. Emotionally, I didn't think I was going to make it sometimes. And what I needed more than anything was that privacy. To get away from the crowds, I decided to get off of the main road and follow a canal that ran parallel to it. At least there weren't so many people, and there I was able to get closer to the animals and the trees, the beauty of India. But one day, as I was following that canal, I noticed that far off to my left, to the north, the road was veering away, and I was no longer paralleling it. So I struck out across the rice paddies and through the jungles, but nightfall came very quickly, and soon I was lost. And I was very frightened because I knew that this was a part of India where there were tigers and poisonous snakes. And just when I thought that I was going to have to spend the night sleeping in that jungle, there appeared a man on the path, just standing there as if though he had been waiting for me. And all he did was he motioned for me to follow me, follow. And I did that. Eventually, he led me to a small house that was surrounded by a tall wall. And everywhere there were roses, big, beautiful roses, some of the biggest I've ever seen anywhere. And he left me at this house. It was a very modern, clean one, much like a European house. He left me alone, and I stayed there overnight. And when I woke up the next morning, I was still by myself. It was as if though I was given the house to use as I pleased, and as if though it really had no owner to it. And I got a pail, and I threw it down the well, and I had the greatest time that morning, just baptizing myself with all that icy cold well water in that bright sunshine. It was to be the only private bath I would have in my entire walk across India. And then, when I was done, I began to wonder, well, what is this place? Well, I found the answer just 3 strides away around the corner of that house. There, I found a very tall banyan tree with its branches hanging very low. And underneath those banyan tree limbs were 2 headstones. One was written in Hindi, which I couldn't understand at all. The other one, though, was written in English. It said, "The divine souls of an extremely simple couple of this area who symbolize love, compassion, and selfless service to mankind are resting here in peace. This place has been constructed by their son in the memory of his most ideal parents, as an expression of his extreme devotion and love towards them." It was so peaceful there that I just had to stay for several days. And the peace and tranquility helped me to get over my father's passing. One night, while looking through some of the cupboards in the house, I found a logbook. And when I read it, I saw that I was the 13th person to ever stay in this place, which was called the International Guest House. I had to smile, too, because in India, 13 is the luckiest number.
Like the lotus flower, in whose beauty the philosopher Buddha is said to have found peace of mind, the scenes I watched throughout Thailand of the people at work in the rice paddies also left me feeling serene. The children at play and the parents watching over their little ones reminded me that the most important thing I had learned during my journey so far was that sharing was what I wanted to do with my life. And I did just that in some of the schools. Imagine their laughter as I tried to act out the word snake. But as I was soon to discover, Thailand had a more ominous side.
Certainly the most frightening time I had on my walk, and the closest I came to death, was to occur in southern Thailand on a stretch of road that most people say is more dangerous than anywhere else in the world. I was walking down that road late at night because it was the monsoon season and it was so hot during the day that I couldn't stand it. And sure enough, about 11:30 that night, I looked over to the right in the weeds by the road, and there were two bandits with machetes waiting to kill me. At first I didn't know what to do because I was so frightened. But then I took the umbrella that I was carrying in my right hand. During the daytime I usually used it to keep the sun off me. And I took that umbrella and I pointed it at the two bandits and I went, "Halt, or I'll shoot you." I tried to make them think it was a gun, but it didn't work too well because they could see the stripes on that umbrella cloth. So I had no choice after a while but to turn and run back down the road the way I'd come. And while I was running, my backpack was just bouncing up and down like this and was weighing me down, so I couldn't go very fast. And the big ugly one of the two bandits finally came around on my left, and he cut me off in front, and I couldn't go any further. So I had to take that umbrella and use it like a club and beat him on the head and the shoulders with it. And I was screaming. I was delirious. I was out of my mind because I was going to die, and I knew it. And the other one, the other bandit, finally came up, and he grabbed my backpack, and he pulled me back like this, like though he was going to pull me clear back onto the ground. And he swung up with his machete, and the blade hit me right there, hit the frame on my backpack right there. If it hadn't hit that little piece of metal, it would have gone right through my head. Well, I thought then, I'm dead. There's no way out of this. But incredibly enough, the guy in front suddenly was running off the road, and nobody was chopping me up from behind. And coming down the road was a pair of headlights. I ran towards the headlights, just waving my umbrella, what was left of it, and stretching my legs across the road after a certain point so there was no way it could get around me. And it stopped. And I ran around to the side, and I tried to get into the back of it, but I couldn't because it was piled with pineapples. And then I ran to the passenger door, and I tried to get in there. And I looked in there, and those poor people, their eyes were that big. They didn't know who this big, tall, white beanpole was that was trying to get into their truck with this ragged umbrella. And the farmer put the truck into gear and started to take off. But I knew that I had to get on that truck because the bandits were still there in the weeds. And as soon as they saw that it wasn't the police, they'd be up to finish me off. So I took the door, and I just flung it open like that, and I tried to claw my way in there. And I was clawing, but I couldn't get in there because it was such a little cab. And all I could do was to grab the poor farmer's wife and to hold on to her as tightly as I could. And she screamed her head off, but I was screaming much, much louder. And they just dragged me with my feet and my legs, just dragging on the road for 2 miles back to this police post. And there I managed to tell the police what was going on, and they went off to get the bandits on their little motorcycle, but by then the bandits were gone. I should have died, and I was very, very frightened. And that night, as I lay on the police post floor, with the ants biting me and hundreds of mosquitoes just buzzing outside of the net trying to get to me, and a lizard crawling across the dingy yellow ceiling, and the sounds of all the swamps out there, I said to myself, "Go home, Steve. Is this worth dying for?" I thought for sure that there was no way I was going to live. Surely in the other 900 kilometers that were awaiting me before Malaysia, there had to be 1 million more bandits out there waiting to kill me. I wanted to give up, and I probably came the closest to giving up on this entire journey that night. But I pushed on. Sometimes I still don't know why, but I did, because I just knew I couldn't give up and give in to my fears.
The Buddhist monks I passed every day on the road provided me the refuge I needed at night from the bandits. Into the protective sanctuary of their monasteries I would venture each evening. Their great serenity and compassion made it easier for me to carry on. In the silent cathedrals of northern Malaysia's rubber forests, time itself seemed to disappear, along with my thoughts. Thus, to suddenly come upon the cacophony of a forest village preparing for some kind of ritual was quite a shock. I watched as they paraded a Hindu goddess through the village and then burned a huge fire and spread the coals. It was a fire walk. It was all I could do to keep my eyes in my head as one plantation worker after another strode across the 20-foot-long pit of extremely hot coals. And certainly not helping my squirming any were the several dazed women who did their share of celebrating by piercing their faces with very, very wicked-looking metal pins. I had witnessed many strange things on my walk, but none quite as amazing as this. I passed quickly, and safely I might add, through the rest of the truly exotic country of Malaysia to my final Asian port of call, the ultra-modern city of Singapore. The vast emptiness and 140-degree temperatures of Australia's interior made using a buggy instead of the backpack necessary for carrying enough food and water. But you can be sure it, or I, didn't look quite this fresh 8 months later when I reached the southern coastline. It would take a book, literally, to list all the reasons the Aussies said crossing the outback alone on foot could not be done. But I set out anyhow to follow the track, the loneliest highway in the world. And what I found was not necessarily the dead heart, as those in the land down under call the interior deserts, but rather something like from the pages of a piece of fiction, if not from another planet. One day I heard the rumbling of machinery, and I found I was in Mintabi, an opal mining camp in the middle of nowhere. Australia produces virtually all of the world's opals, most of them from small claims like this one. The owners were known to the other prospectors as the Three Silly Gooses because they had made their fortune in a place that others said was barren of gemstone. I stayed with them a while and even took a trip down into one of their shafts. You can see just how enthused I was at that invitation. On the day I left, Ian, the bearded bear on the left, gave me a beautiful opal stone to carry home as a gift to my mother. Gratefully, I stowed it into my pack on the cart and bid farewell to those kind silly gooses.
A little shade like this sure would have been nice out there in the Australian outback. And after I left those three guys at Mintabi, there wasn't to be very much, believe me, because the desert only got hotter and much worse. So much, in fact, that I decided to walk at night. Well, the first night I tried walking, wouldn't you know it, some drunken Aussie pulls up in an old truck and gives me a hard time about being a Yank and a journalist, and walking across his country, too. So I let him know what I thought of his intelligence level, and we ended up getting in a little bit of a shuffle out there, and I had to run off because he got his shotgun out and was going to shoot me. When I came back the next morning, my gear was scattered all over the place. I had to gather it all up and put it back onto my cart, and I went on down across the desert. And 2 days after that, I got to thinking to myself, wait a second, I didn't see that little opal stone when I was gathering up the things. And I looked, and I went through everything. I went through all the pockets in the sleeping bag, through all my pockets, checked all over. I couldn't find it. I felt sick to my stomach. How could I lose something so beautiful to something as evil as that character? And on top of that, a gift to my mother. I went on, and the heat got worse, the flies, I was thirstier, and with the opal stone missing and that attack, the whole magic of the place was gone. I just wanted to get the heck out of there and get done with Australia. 2 days later, though, this old car pulled up in a cloud of dust, and these two guys poked their heads out and they said, "You know, what are you doing?" This time I told them that I was just hiking across a little part of the outback. We shared some grog in the shade of the car, and I got around to telling them what I was really doing. And I also told them about the attack and losing the stone. And they insisted on going back up there and finding that little stone. And I said, "Are you guys nuts?" I said, "It's 1,000,000 to 1, maybe 1,000,000,000 to 1 chance of finding that little opal stone." But they wanted to do it. They insisted. To them, I guess it was some kind of fun challenge. And so I said, "Okay, let's go." And so we piled into the car and we went up, bouncing over all the stones and rocks back to where the attack occurred. It must have been 100 miles back. And when we got up there, we all tumbled out and looked through the sand, and I mean, we really got down low and sifted through it and everything on our hands and knees. But no opal stone. And I was the first one to give up and go back in the car and tell them to forget it. But then one of the men, who was looking way off, maybe 100 feet off from where the attack had occurred, he held up a little box and he said, "Is this it?" And I could feel my heart beating real quickly because I recognized that box. It had held the little stone. And I got out of the car and I ran over there real quickly and I looked in the box and nothing. I turned to go back to the car when a little glint of blue caught my eye. And I turned back around and I looked at him and I said, "Don't move." And I looked down, and there, just underneath the toe of his boot, I saw the stone. I couldn't believe it. I bent down and very carefully moved the sand aside and lifted up that little stone. It was a miracle. We'd found it. And as we went back to their camp that night, the two men were sitting in the front with their dog, just shaking their head the whole way, going, "Magic. Magic, mate. It had to be magic, mate. How else can you explain finding that?" And I was in the back seat, bouncing back there and thinking to myself, yeah, it was magic, wasn't it? And I remember looking out at the sunset and looking at that beautiful red sun on that turquoise sky and the clouds streaking it and forming all kinds of colors, just like that stone. And I knew then that I'd found not just one gem that day, but 3 gems.
Everyone had worried that I might succumb to loneliness in the outback, but that was not such a big problem as it might have seemed. It was true those I met were few and far between, but for the most part they were so interesting as to give me plenty to think about until my next chance meeting with another person. They were every bit as gem-like as those opal hunters. They would include 90-year-old Margaret telling sheep ranching tales, Dan fishing on his favorite billabong, Mishigoshi repairing my cart's flat tire, diesel oil holding up our lunch, truckies like Steve and his 115-ton 62-wheeled road trains, cockies or ranchers like Bruce, as well as the jackaroo hands like Tiny or the swaggering Johnny O'Brien, and then the lowest but hardest workers on the cowboy totem pole, the wild horse bronc riders. Grandma Sybil, who was dying of cancer but still had plenty of love for her clan and the orphaned Joeys she loved to care for. The Alice Springs weatherman, Peter, wooing a drop of rain from his good luck crystal ball. Stricky, the street sweeper who wouldn't have traded jobs with anyone. To even the Pink Panther, enjoying a bottle of grog and the chance to wet a line in Lake Lerma. And then, in one of the harshest settings anywhere, I came upon the most bizarre scene yet. Carved into the heart of a hill of sandstone were the sculptures and hallways of the dugout home of Crocodile Harry, a former European baron trying his best to escape a mankind he had learned to distrust during World War II. His underground home's chambers reflected Harry's strong commitment to individualism and independence. For several days, like a couple of refugees from reality, we swapped war stories, with Harry's dog, Prince Ferdinand, always at our feet. Then it was down the long and straight road to my last destination in Australia, Melbourne.
Australia was undoubtedly one of the most difficult of all the chapters to draw to a close. For one thing, I had given it a year of my life, and it in return had given me an exceptionally large number of friends. Among the brightest of those was Peg Matthews, a 65-year-old widow in Melbourne. Peg took care of me for 3 months after my walk in the outback was completed. She did everything she could to treat me like a son and to make me feel like I was back home with my own mom. Peg used to do things like cook chili and bake southern fried chicken. She even made a pumpkin pie, which was a little difficult for her because the Aussies like to eat pumpkin as a vegetable. Peg was one of those exceptional human beings, someone who never seemed to run out of love and compassion. And when it came time to leave Peg and Melbourne and all the rest of Australia, it was all I could do to hold back the tears at the airport. I couldn't get anything past that frog in my throat, but Peg somehow managed to say to me that no matter wherever I go, I'll always be a son to her. And when this steel door at that security area in the airport shut between us, I thought I'd never get that sound out of my ears, for it was closing not only on one of the most beautiful people and most enchanting nations in the world, but was also closing on the foreign part of my journey. Because now, all that was left was my own homeland.
First stop on the last road to home was Canada, where families like this one made sure that my walk from Vancouver to the American border wouldn't be forgotten. Then at last, after 3 years, there was my homeland, America. Like someone falling in love all over, I lost my heart to the skyscrapers of Seattle and the forests and whitewaters of the Pacific Northwest. The roads could be as windy as they wished, for that only meant more surprises ahead along the road, like these bison. So much in love again was I with my own homeland, I let a summer and the fall pass almost unnoticed before I reached the 2-mile-high peaks of the Continental Divide.
Warm campfire, fresh bed of pine needles. This is how I had to spend a lot of nights on the walk when I didn't have a home to stay in. I didn't even have a campfire a lot of times. I can remember, for instance, when I was crossing the Rocky Mountains in the dead of winter. I was crossing over Togetee Pass near Jackson Hole, Wyoming. It's 25 below zero, and there must have been 3 feet of snow blowing on the ground. I didn't even have a tent. I just slept each night in the snow, just wrapped in my sleeping bag and a Gore-Tex jacket. I stayed warm, even though I woke up each morning with 6 inches of fresh snow on my face. I sure gained a lot of respect for those pioneers that crossed this country a long time ago on foot. How they did it, I'll never know.
With the mountains behind me, I followed the valleys into Wyoming and my first real Thanksgiving meal in 4 years. How thankful indeed I continued to be in the rest of my walk across America's heartland. This was a nation so remarkably blessed with food, history, opportunities, and, of course, happiness. If you ask me, those final miles went by much too quickly.
Well, my body's relieved, but I think my spirit's a little sad at all the people I'm leaving behind, and all the families that took care of me, all the moms and pops back there. But I'm also very, very happy because it means I get to see my own family again.
As my friends and neighbors from Ohio joined with me to walk those last few miles, I was reminded of all the people who in their own way had been walking with me for my entire journey.
Hi, everybody.
If they only knew how often their letters and prayers had been the only things that kept me going. I had walked over 20,000 miles through 20 countries on 5 continents. It was the highlight of my life to know that I had reached a goal that everyone else had said could never be achieved. I had gone through what seemed like a million cans of baked beans, dozens of pairs of socks, and incredibly, I was only on my 4th pair of Rocky boots. And now, I was home.
I will never forget this day if I live to be 150. And just as millions of other people helped me get around the world, you can include yourself in that numbers, because this is just as important. Coming home. I want to say that I love you. I love you. Thank you. Those tears I cried when I stepped up onto that front porch that morning had been building steadily all day. I had come to the end of my dream. When I left that same home 4 years before, there were those who warned that only a nightmare could come from such foolishness as walking around the world. To be so trusting of people was to risk losing everything, especially my life, they cautioned. Still, I ventured forth. I had to know the truth. What is the truth I was to find? It is that love still lives as strongly as ever. That love is a force as real and powerful as any in our universe. I know, because I felt it everywhere, from the crowded streets of New York City to the loneliest mud hut in Pakistan. The truth is that I am your son and your brother, and you are more than just my neighbor. You are my family. The truth is that for all the ugliness and hurt we see each day, there are a million times more acts of compassion and beauty that pass silently unnoticed. The truth is that I never did leave home. Home was never ahead of me, and it was never behind me. I was there all along. Know that even as you're watching this, there's a mother somewhere in Thailand laughing as her children play beside a golden rice paddy, while in Ireland, a young man is picking daisies from a beautiful green field to give to his red-haired sweetheart. And in the rugged mountains of Yugoslavia, there's a gypsy family huddled around a campfire, weary from another day of chopping wood. The people who share this planet may look different, but they have the same hopes, the same fears, the same yearning for peace and happiness in their lives as you and I. And to all the people of the world who opened up your homes and your hearts to me, I want you to know that your love will always shine above all else in this magical tale that has so enriched my life. The triumph of the World Walk is yours as much as it is mine. I'll never forget you.
There's a full moon over India, and Gandhi lives again. Who's to say you have to lose for someone else to win? In the eyes of all the people, the look is much the same. For the first is just the last one when you play a deadly game. It's about time we realize it. We're all in this together. It's about time we find out it's all of us or none. It's about time we recognize it. These changes in the weather. It's about time. It's about changes, and it's about time. There's a light in the Vatican window for all the world to see, and a voice cries in the wilderness, and sometimes he speaks for me. I suppose I love him most of all when he kneels to kiss the land. With his lips upon our mother's breast, he makes his strongest stand. It's about time we start to see it. The earth is our only home. It's about time we start to face it. We can't make it here all alone. It's about time we start to listen to the voices in the wind. It's about time. It's about changes, and it's about time. There's a man who is my brother. I just don't know his name, but I know his home and family, because I know we feel the same. And it hurts me when he's hungry and when his children cry. I too am a father, and that little one is mine. It's about time we begin it, to turn the world around. It's about time we start to make it the dream we've always known. It's about time we start to live it, the family of man. It's about time, it's about changes, and it's about time. It's about peace, and it's about plenty, and it's about time. It's about you and me together, and it's about time.